Thank you, Miss Gillen. Being aged 67, most of the people that I talk to are my sort of age. And so we rarely ever ask this question. The question, of course, we tend to ask ourselves is, will our children be poorer than us? But all the presentation courses say that try to focus it on what the audience will be interested in, so I've turned the question around. And because this is a talk, a lecture, rather than a puzzle or a detective story, let me give you the short version, or the answer now, as far as I'm concerned. The short answer is no. The long answer develops in the course of the talk. So I'm going to start with just a little bit more about my own sort of life history, and some of what I do now. Then I'm going to tackle the question itself. And finally, and the most important part of the session is, of course, questions and answers. And feel free to ask questions not just about the main topic, but about any of the other things that I mention in the course of passing that I do. So I was born in the middle of nowhere in the Punjab, a place where there were no schools. Came to the UK with my mother. My father was already here, and grew up in the slums of Chorlton or Medlock, which most people have never heard of, because in a sense it doesn't really exist anymore. It's now just been flattened, and it's all part of Manchester University, Manchester Metropolitan University. Where the Commonwealth swimming pool in Manchester is very close to where I used to live. Then moved to Moss Side. And from that background, I went to a state grammar school after passing the 11 plus in Clare College, Cambridge, did a PGC at Leeds and became a teacher for a year and discovered accountancy and spent the rest of my life as a tax advisor. And I was the second person from an ethnic minority to be a partner in Price Waterhouse. Although by the time I retired, at the end of 2009, out of about 900 partners, I think we had about 45 from ethnic minorities. If you're interested, there's a lot more about me, as well as about 500 pages of other writings at my website, mohammedamin.com. And I'm recording this talk, and assuming the technology works okay, this talk itself will be on my website fairly soon. So what do I do in retirement? 3 categories. Working directly with individual people, giving them advice. And this crops up completely randomly, completely haphazardly. And sometimes it's a half-an-hour telephone call with a person I've never met and never seen. And sometimes it's a sort of slow 10-year relationship. I'm involved with a lot of organizations. I've got plenty of spare time, of course. I've been a politics junkie since the age of 10, when I got up early to get the result of the American presidential election. And I've been a Conservative Party member for over 30 years because I believe in the virtues of free market capitalism. I'm the co-chair of the Muslim Jewish Forum of Greater Manchester, which I helped to start. And from that local connection in Manchester, I've got to know many of the leading lights of the Jewish community nationally. I've known the President of the Board of Deputies now for about 8 years, for example. And starting with the Jewish community, which is quite a small community, about 300,000 people in this country. As a result of meeting one Mormon at a reception at random, I've got to know the leadership of the church in the UK. I've met 3 of the world's top 15 Mormons, and last month I spent a week in Utah and Washington attending a symposium on international religious freedom organized by Brigham Young University. And both because of the politics and because of the Muslim-Jewish connection, I've been to Israel. I find myself writing regularly about terrorism. After the terrible bombing at the Manchester Arena, for example, and I had some of my own relatives in the arena, although fortunately they were unhurt, I ended up writing 3 pieces that week, which were published on terrorism. Clare College totally changed my life. I've been a member of the Alumni Council for about the last sort of 6 years, And in 2014, I was very surprised to be elected as Clare College's Alumnus of the Year. I gave a 22-minute speech, which was recorded by somebody, and that's actually on my website as well. And I've been a private investor since my mid-20s. And because of that, I belong to a body called the UK Shareholders Association, and given my background in accounting and tax, when they needed volunteers, I volunteered to be a member of their policy team. And there are many other organizations I'm involved with where I have no leadership role. I stay very busy because I did not retire so I could watch more television. And the third category of things that I do is communicating outwards. A growing proportion of it is speaking in schools, both either because the school approaches me directly, which is what Miss Gillen did, or through a charity called Speakers for Schools, set up by the BBC journalist Robert Peston. And with a live audience, of course, you can get some perception of whether what you're saying is sinking in, whether people are interested or not. But when you broadcast, of course, you have no idea. But I've done over 30 broadcasts on BBC Radio Manchester of a very short slot, Thought for the Week, a bit like Thought for the Day on Radio 4. Most recent one was on Sunday that's just gone. Not yesterday, but the week before. Other bits of radio and TV. I've only been on the BBC National News once, but I'm quite often on satellite TV. And I write. Conservative Home's a website for Conservative Party activists. Islamic Finance News is a magazine in Malaysia where every month I have to find 600 words that are interesting on Islamic finance. And finally, my website. So, on to the main topic. Will you be poorer than your parents? That's a chart from the Bank of England, the Office for National Statistics, of average UK salary. It's real salary adjusted by the Consumer Prices Index from 1855 to now. And if you look, for example, around about 1900, it's just under £5,000 a year, compared to a high point of 25, 27, 26, 27,000, something like that, just before the global financial crisis. And then, of course, we see a long slide. And the width of that slide is much longer than, for example, that, which was a recession in the mid-1970s. And oddly enough, even the Great Depression, which we hear so much about, there was a very short period of going down and then a period of being flat before income started rising again. So you can understand why that question is being asked so often. Although the most recent thing that's happened to that chart, of course, is that the curve has turned back up again. And as somebody who's been around a long time, one thing I have noticed about journalists, the commentary of people that you meet in the street, everybody, any trend that they see on a graph, the normal way that they predict the future is by taking a ruler and projecting the curve that's already there and drawing a straight line and carrying on. That is the level of most analysis. So if the stock market is going down, people expect it to go down forever, and vice versa. Let's have a look at some other facts. My television packed up last week. I bought it in 2006. It's lasted extremely well. It's a really nice Sony flat screen, 42-inch high definition, and that's what it cost. I've been searching on Amazon for a replacement, and I haven't decided for definite, but this is probably what we'll get as a replacement. 49-inch, so it's bigger. It's smart, meaning it's internet connected. It's got 4K, so the resolution is far, far higher than my Sony from 2006. HDR, that's the quality of the sort of color range. Quantum LEDs, $13.99. Now, in terms of the national accounts, if I buy that TV, as a comparison with the TV I bought in 2006, that is simply a transaction where the country is poorer, because the number 1399, of course, is lower than 2156. No matter how hard the statisticians try, they simply cannot adjust the national accounts for this kind of technological change. And this is not super dramatic technological change. I used to read a lot of science fiction when I was a teenager. And I also used to watch Star Trek on TV at that time. I used to watch the original Star Trek series when it first came out. And I always fantasized about having a sort of computer terminal in my bedroom, which would be connected somehow to a hole in the wall and a wire, and to a supercomputer at the other end, where you could find anything that you wanted to know. With all the money in the world in the 1960s, that was not available. Yes, computers existed, they were big, they were very expensive, and they were also pretty incapable. When I was a student at Cambridge in 1970, I remember programming, or trying to program, because my thing never ran, our Atlas supercomputer. It filled a building, and compared to computers today, it was utter rubbish. Every one of you is carrying around in your pockets a smartphone that gives you what I wanted in the 1960s, and it costs you next to nothing. And none of that can get measured in our national accounts. And to really emphasize the point, because I used to get very angry when I heard this question about will our children be poorer than others, I wrote a piece a few years ago where, rather than talking about decades, because 2006 compared to now is 11 years, my TVs, that fantasy terminal, we're only talking 40 years, I decided to look back roughly 3,000 years. And I decided to do a serious comparison of myself with the richest man in the world at that time, Pharaoh Ramesses II of Egypt. What do I have that he didn't have, and what did he have that I don't have? And how much do I value those things? And the only thing I can think of that he had that I might be interested in, if it were not for my religious beliefs, is an unlimited supply of concubines. Apart from that, there's nothing else that he had. He had the power to, whip his flunkies and have their heads cut off, but why should you want that? He had unlimited amounts of food, but there's a limit to how much you can eat. And in terms of the quality of food and the range of food, what I can pick up going around Asda is incomparably superior to what Ramesses II had available. And in terms of how to spend his spare time, to put it at its most extreme, he never watched a Shakespeare play. Why not? Because Shakespeare hadn't written any plays by then. We get richer as a society year by year in so many ways. Every time somebody writes a new play, creates a new song, there was a time when the Beatles hadn't actually written their music, or Bob Dylan hadn't written it. Once Bob Dylan has written it, yes, he makes a lot of money himself by collecting the royalties, but it becomes part of the property of the entire human race for all time. And we forget that so easily. So after having looked backwards, let's think about the future. One of my favorite quotes. Put your hands up if you've heard of Yogi Berra. A few. He was a very famous American baseball manager, but he's most remembered for his line of quotes. And this is one of my favorites. It's hard making predictions, but especially if you're trying to make predictions about the future. But I'm going to try. So let's have a look at some trends. I play chess. I've played chess since the age of 9. I was once the finance director of the British Chess Federation when I got introduced for a few minutes or so to Garry Kasparov and Anatoly Karpov when they were playing the World Chess Championship match in London. And in 1996, it finally happened. A computer was able to beat the world chess champion at playing chess. This is something that computer scientists have been thinking about and working towards for decades. I also play Go, which is a Japanese board game. I took it up when I was at university. I've got a 1-dan Go certificate. And Go is a far more subtle and far more difficult game than chess. And computers, even when they could beat the world champion at chess, were still hopeless at Go until 2016, when using neural learning, etc., Google's DeepMind, AlphaGo, finally defeated the world's top Go player, Lee Sedol. And the other thing, totally unconnected with computer technology, although computer technology has been important in enabling these other things to happen, in the 1950s, some scientists based in Cambridge discovered the structure of DNA. And one of them, James Watson, is actually connected with Clare College. I think he was a postgrad there. In the 1990s, we finally decoded the human genome at enormous cost. It cost about $3 billion. We can now decode a human genome for far less than that. A full decoding, I think, is easily under $1,000, and you get a partial decoding for not much money. And very dramatically, in the last few years, we developed the ability to using a technology called CRISPR-Cas9 to edit the genome, where you can take one chemical out of one place on the DNA strand and replace it with another one, just like typing with a typewriter. And let me give you some personal forecasts. My car is 17 years old because for the last 10 years I've lived in London most of the time. Cars in Manchester, so it doesn't get used much. And my personal guess is that, and it's in pretty good condition, that car will keep going and be the last car I ever buy. Because once self-driving cars are available, you don't need to buy your own self-driving car. You just summon it up on an app the way you summon an Uber right now. I also expect, and even though I'm 67, I want to be fit and healthy for as long as possible, but eventually things catch up with you. By then, I have every expectation that the person or thing that cares for me is not another human being, but a robot. That not just helps to pick me up and get me out of bed, but actually talks to me and asks me how I'm doing. And I really do forecast a material cornucopia, a horn of plenty, especially when we get to the stage where robots can make other robots. And going back to the DNA technology, when we can eliminate most genetic diseases, and not just use the technology for things like that. I was at a conference yesterday in Salisbury, the annual winter gathering of the Muslim Institute, and we had a presentation about halal food. And one of the global trends, of course, is as societies get richer, they eat a lot more meat. But producing meat requires so much more farmland, so much more water resources than growing grain. And it's unsustainable for the whole world to eat meat at the rate that, say, Americans eat it. But with modern technology, I mean, they've already produced a completely artificial hamburger. It was a special project which was in the media about 1.5 years ago, and that hamburger cost $250,000. But of course, Pathfinder projects always cost a lot of money. Eventually, I expect to see most meat replaced by artificially grown meat. And some people really did see it coming. One of my favorite science fiction writers, Isaac Asimov, who I read a lot of in my teenage years, my 20s and 30s, he wrote this in 1957, a book called The Naked Sun. It's actually a detective story involving a team of detectives, one human being, Elijah Bailey, one robot, Daniel Oliver, and they're trying to solve a murder mystery on a planet called Solaria. But what is really important for me is what I remember about the planet Solaria as Isaac Asimov described it. It's a planet with 20 million people and 200 million robots, where all the humans live like ancient Roman wealthy landowners in their own villa, with their robots around them, but almost no company, and they communicate with other people on the planet, not by traveling to them in person, but through 3D sort of video projection. And that really is, as far as I'm concerned, the future that awaits us. The question is, though, because everything so far has been upbeat and positive, that leaves a really serious personal challenge for all of you, because this is the future that, I mean, I expect to see quite a lot of this, but you are 40 years younger than me, and there's a lot of it, no, 50 years younger than me, so there's a lot of it awaiting you. The most important question, how do you value yourselves? The norm in our society right now is to walk up to somebody at a meeting and they ask you, what do you do? You say, I am a chartered accountant or a surveyor or an engineer. You describe yourself by the job that you do. And one of the biggest challenges that I had when I retired was, how do I describe myself? Because you don't want to perpetually look back, say, I used to be a partner in PwC, because that's a pretty negative way to talk about yourself. What happens when you don't have a job, but you have plenty of spending power? Because the future I see, people, the state is simply us as a society, how we organize ourselves. If we can produce vast amounts of things with very little human effort, there's no reason why we can't come up with an economic system that shares those. People are already talking about something called a universal basic income. And I expect this to come. But the question is, what gives your life meaning in that situation? Because most of us have always derived the meaning in our lives from the jobs that we do. But this, while it's a new challenge for most people in society, is a challenge that other people have faced before and can always face. Who can tell me the names of all three of these guys? Any volunteers? Oh. Yes. Almost. John and Jack are the same name. John F. Kennedy, he was often called Jack Kennedy. The shorter guy to his left shoulder is Robert Francis Kennedy, who John F. Kennedy, we know, is President of the USA. Robert F. Kennedy, he appointed as Attorney General of the United States, and his great joke was that he felt that Robert should get some practice at the law before he tried setting up his own legal practice while making him Attorney General. And afterwards, he became a United States Senator, and sadly, he was assassinated when he was running for the presidency in 1968. And I still remember waking up to the news of the assassination and being devastated. And then Edward Moore Kennedy also became a United States Senator and stayed in the Senate basically until he died of cancer a few years ago. There was one other brother who was killed in the Second World War, Joe Jr. But the Kennedy brothers all inherited lots of money from their father. And of course, they're not the only wealthy Americans or wealthy British people. There are very many people in society who have genuinely never needed to work, the children of the rich. And they've always had to find ways of making their lives meaningful and worthwhile. Now, some people don't succeed. I read recently, 5-6 years ago now, about the daughter, or it was either the daughter or daughter-in-law of a man called Hans Rausing. Does anybody recognize the name Hans Rausing? Yep. Right. He's an elderly, I don't know if he's still alive, he's an elderly Swedish billionaire, and he invented the technology and the business behind Tetra Pak, which originally made sort of literally tetrahedral cartons of orange juice, and now all the other kind of packaging that you get for milk and so on uses the same kind of technology. And sadly, his daughter-in-law died of a drug overdose in Chelsea because she and I think her husband were drug addicts. So that's a negative side of never having to work. You can actually end up destroying your life as well. But very many wealthy people have had to face up to what do you do when it isn't your job that gives meaning to your life. And of course, the same issues is faced by almost everybody who retires. As a retiree, I don't need to work. So everything so far has been extremely upbeat and positive, but there are still things to worry about, serious issues that never go away. Global warming is a real issue. potentially devastating for large parts of the world. Thermonuclear war hasn't been abolished as a risk. And sadly, every new technology also has downsides. CRISPR-Cas9, which has the ability to get rid of all genetic diseases, at the same time makes it much easier to manufacture artificial plagues. And this is a real sort of potential concern. And that's it. Over to you for questions and answers.